I tried to take a much more human conversational approach to it.
Yeah.
And it got me nominated for a couple Emmys. So
Hey, friendo, Steve here.
And Larson.
And you're watching Tom Talks Rubbish.
What's going on, guys? It's your boy, Tom Talks Rubbish, and today I'm back with another interview. This time, I'm joined by, and I can only describe him as a podcasting legend. So welcome to the show, Jon Alba.
I appreciate that, but that is so not even remotely accurate, but I appreciate the kind words, Tom. Thank you for having me.
As I say, man, like, you are someone that I have looked up to since I started doing this small channel. And it was if he wants to come on, I'm down. Let's do this.
I appreciate that. So
what came first? Was it a love of wrestling or was it a love of broadcasting?
They're pretty simultaneous, truthfully. I knew what I wanted to do with my life when I was 5 years old. I was watching a New York Yankees game when I was 5 years old, baseball, and I turned to my mom and I said, I want to be the guy that talks about that one day.
Wow.
So I knew I wanted to be a sportscaster in some capacity. And at the same time, that was around when I was really starting to get into wrestling too. So there's a synergy. I never envisioned that I'd be talking about pro wrestling for my career until probably the last 5 years or so. That's when that started to kind of become a potential reality. And then the pieces all kind of came together a little bit. And here we are today.
So were you that kid that was mimicking JR when he was watching the wrestling, for example?
Not so much with wrestling, more so with traditional sports. I was definitely the kid that would turn the audio off and I would try to call the game on my own. And that was something that I was doing from a very young age until I started doing live online sports talk radio, which is kind of the predecessor to podcasts, if you will. So I was about eighth grade there. So I was maybe, I don't know what's eighth grade, like 13 years old, 12, 13 years old. Yeah, so that's when I started kind of my first foray into actually broadcasting. It probably wasn't any good, but it was a start.
As I always say with a lot of content creators, if you don't look back on your content and you don't cringe at your early stuff, then you haven't improved, in my opinion.
Man, I still cringe at stuff that I did 2 years ago. You know,
really?
It's oh yeah. I don't feel that I became a good broadcaster until probably 4 years into my professional on-air career at the very least. And then I don't think I became, I mean, I'd like to think I'm a pretty strong pro at this point, but I don't think I even reached that level until about 2 or so years ago. I'd say that's really when I started to kind of find my mojo.
What was it that helped you discover, I'll use your word, mojo? Was it a specific podcast you were doing at the time? Was it maybe just repetition?
Well, again, it wasn't so much podcast. You know, I was in TV news. So I was a traditional sportscaster on the news multiple times a week, several times a night, on camera, live TV. And when you're getting live reps, that's everything. Reps are everything. And I say that to any young aspiring broadcaster. Reps are how you cut your teeth. So, you know, the reps start to accumulate after a period of time. And I know you're in the UK, but, you know, stock car racing is huge here, not so much Formula
Yeah.
One, but NASCAR. And I was covering the Daytona 500, which I'm not sure if you're familiar or not, but that's like the premier
I've
NASCAR
heard
race.
the name, but I couldn't tell you much about it, if that makes
The
sense.
Daytona 500 is like the premier NASCAR race, iconic venue, and all that. And I was covering it, and there was a really, really traumatic crash on the final lap where pretty much everybody thought that the driver was dead. And I was live 11 times around the country that night on different stations. And I took a very cognizant approach to how I talked about it. There's a lot of sportscasters when they go up and talk about something is very, it was on the final lap and Ryan Newman rolled his car and all that. I tried to take a much more human conversational approach to it.
Yeah.
And it got me nominated for a couple Emmys. So that was kind of my first, okay, if this is my approach to broadcasting, I will find success. So I think if you listen to one of my podcasts, you tend to hear that, maybe sometimes even to a fault where it's a little too laid back, but I try to be very conversational in my nature.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that I've picked up listening to, particularly the Wives of Wrestling podcast. I find that one very conversational, to be honest. And I enjoy that one.
Thank you. That is that project has been a whirlwind, but it has been so much fun. And those two ladies are incredible.
We'll get into all that in due time, I'm sure. So if we continue throughout your sportscasting career and your wrestling fandom, as you started covering traditional sports, did your wrestling fandom wane at all, or was it heightened?
No, I'd say it was heightened. I started covering pro wrestling for like online websites probably 2012 or so, I want to say. So about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I started my first consistent podcast with my current Up for Debate co-host, Doug McDonald. We had a podcast called Living the Gimmick that ran from 2015 until last year. 300 consecutive weeks, never missed an episode. And it was a lot, but it was great in helping me kind of figure out, okay, how much of pro wrestling do I truly understand? And combining that with working the independent scene, because I work on the independent scene frequently, learning the true nuances of pro wrestling, that made me a better broadcaster too.
You talked about working on the independent scene there. And something I'm very curious
signs back there, right there. If
that
Alba
is,
shows up, we riot. Who the hell let Jon Alba back in? I'm a sign collector, so
that is very cool. And that brings me to a question I'll ask you in a bit. But how do you feel that working on the independent scene has helped you with your podcasts, or maybe hindered it in some ways?
Oh no, it certainly hasn't hindered it. It's only helped. Learning how to put a match together, learning the nuances of storytelling has been so enormously helpful in helping grow me as a professional wrestling broadcaster, without a doubt. And especially with the Extreme Life of Matt Hardy show that I do, where Matt and I really go into the nitty gritty of his matches. And I'm understanding why at this point in the match you're doing the heat, and why he does this sort of move at this point, and how it leads into building the finish. Like, we just taped an episode before I hopped on with you, and we spent a good 20 minutes talking about the importance of keeping characters hot when you're going into a big match, and not cutting them off by the legs, and the psychology that goes behind that, and is let it all play out like a real thing that people should invest in, or all that. So like, working on the independent scene was critical for me understanding that stuff. It helped me network better, and it's made me more in tune with some of the up and coming stars of professional wrestling today.
That's very cool to hear, man. So if we go into how you pitch a show to a guest, for example, not a guest, but like, we'll call them, is co-host the right word?
Yeah, sure.
for like the Matt Hardy show and the Wives of Wrestling, is it you that's going to pitch, for example, the Extreme Life of Matt Hardy? Are you going to him and pitching, or is it something that he's reaching out to you for?
Yeah, so I think it's circumstantial. In Matt's case, I've talked about this at length, including in the Sports Illustrated article that we did, but Matt Hardy was one of my guys growing up. You know, the Hardy
Mhm.
Boys, obviously, but Matt Hardy specifically. There was just something, I thought he was the secret sauce of the Hardy Boys.
I saw
So,
this in an article that I read about you.
yes. So I always thought that. And probably around 2017, 2018, I just said to myself, man, a Matt Hardy podcast would be so good. This guy would have so many stories to tell. He's got such a great mind for the industry. He was always a step ahead of the curve, right?
Mm.
And when he followed me on Twitter, I think maybe about a year ago, and I just connected with him and just said, hey, this is who I am. Been following your work for so long, blah, blah, blah. And then when I got brought in as part of Conrad's team,
Mhm.
that was like a little street cred, right? So it's like, okay, I want to make an impact here. So I'm going to pitch this. And I DM'd him and I said, hey, man, I just need 5 minutes of your time. I got an idea. And I think it's something you might be interested in. And it took about 3 weeks for him to get back to me, but he did. And I pitched it and we got lunch together and talked about it in person. And at the end of that, he said, I'm in, let's do it. So that was kind of manifesting something and shooting my shot. Whereas with the wives or Strictly Business right now that I have with Eric Bischoff and Ad Free Shows, those were concepts that they're like, all right, John, we're bringing this idea to you that there's going to be a podcast with Kurt Angle and Randy Orton's wives. Now go create a show.
Who's pitching the idea to you?
My higher ups.
Okay.
But there's no concept involved. It was
This
just
is an ad-free shows, correct?
yeah. So it's just like, hey, this is Kim Warren, this is Giovanna Angle. They're best friends and they want to do a podcast. Figure it out.
Ooh.
So there's no idea. It's just they want to do a podcast. So what does that podcast look like? How long is it going to be? What are the assets that we're going to need? How often is it going to be? Who are these women? I've never met these women. I've never talked to these women. So then it was a 4.5 month odyssey of figuring all that stuff out. And yeah, I've produced a lot of my own content. So I feel like that's kind of in my wheelhouse. So coming up with ideas is a strength of mine. So that's what we did with them. That's what I just did with Bischoff, with Strictly Business and Up for Debate and one-on-one. So there's a lot going on there.
You talked about, actually, 2 questions. You talked about what show is basically easier to pitch, to produce? Is it something that was your baby almost, like with the Wives of Wrestling the Matt Hardy show, where you basically bought the entire idea? Or did you find it easier to pitch, like almost, they want a podcast, I'm going to let them figure it out?
Well, with the wives, they wanted a podcast, and it was collaborative. I want to make it very clear. It was collaborative,
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of the ideas were kind of my brainchild. And like, this is how we're going to structure the show. This is how we're going to keep the flow of conversation going. So I think any time that I get a chance to kind of flex the creative muscle, it's going to be inherently a little easier, but I'm also going to put more pressure on myself. So yeah, sure. Someone may have come to me with the idea for the general concept of the podcast. You're going to have a podcast with these 2 women, but when there's nothing to go off of and you say, okay, well, what's the show about? I don't know, figure it out. Then, there's a lot that goes into that. With Matt's show in particular, I do all the research for that. So I'm spending days going through articles, newsletters, interviews, everything, watching matches, and that all goes into it. So you combine that with the wives, with Strictly Business, with Up for Debate, with Time Limit Draw, with Lash LaRue, with One-on-One, and any of our bonus shows we have on Ad Free Shows. I feel, and I'm close to 10 podcasts deep right now, which
As
is
I said, the
a
podcast
lot.
guru, in my opinion.
Now, Conrad's the podfather. He is the guy, and any way that I can help contribute, I'm more than happy to.
The pod son, then, maybe?
The redheaded stepchild, we'll say.
Okay. So another thing you talked about was joining Conrad's team of podcasters, correct? So how did something like that come about?
Yeah, I had been a big fan of Conrad's podcast from pretty much day one. I was listening to Something to Wrestle by like episode 2 or 3. And over the years we interacted. I did a news piece on he and Bruce Pritchard. Then we kept in touch over the years. And about a year ago, after WrestleMania, probably about a year ago this week, he gave me a call and was like, "Hey, I want to bring you on to do some stuff." I was like, "Yeah, that's cool, man. Like, I would love to host some stuff for you, but I got to check with my TV news contracts, all that stuff. There's a lot of weeds you got to dig through."
Mhm.
And we hung up. I was like, I think he was talking about bringing me on full time. So I called him right back and I was like, "Hey, did you mean like bringing me in full time?" He's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Huh." And then you get into the nitty gritty of it and you start talking money and is it viable? Is it feasible? And it was. And we haven't even launched into like many of the things he brought me on for, which is the exciting stuff. Like that stuff's going to come at some point. But in the meantime, I'm having a blast doing everything I'm doing right now and certainly am more than busy. So it's been great.
Mhm. So, one thing I am curious to know about as well, with everything that you do you still consider yourself a wrestling fan, or has wrestling become like I don't want to say mundane, but like part of your job?
I mean, wrestling is definitely part of my job. And there's no doubt about that. I watch a lot of pro wrestling every single day.
Mhm.
Um, I still make, and I actually got asked about this yesterday too. I still make time to enjoy it for myself. I make sure that I do. And it might take more now for me to really sit down and just be like, man, that match was freaking incredible. But whenever I can sit back and just get sucked in, because I'm a storyteller at heart, that's like
Yeah.
what my trade was. So when I can get sucked into a match, man, that's just everything. Like that FTR Young Bucks match that was on Dynamite, I just got sucked into that. And I messaged Dax Harwood after, and I was just like, I gotta thank you for that, because like that was everything I love about pro wrestling. So yeah, man, I try to make sure that there's still that glimmer of fandom at the end of the day.
If that passion and fandom went away completely, would you have to say to Conrad, "Look, I need to step away to reinvigorate my fandom to enjoy this"?
I don't know. Who's to say? It could happen, but I hope it doesn't. It definitely happened with me for TV news, where it was something that I really loved, but the industry just wore me down. And by the end of it, I was like, I want to still be a broadcaster. I feel like I'm doing the best on-air work of my life, but the wear and tear of TV news is just killing me. And
Yeah.
I was losing the passion for it. I was losing the passion for telling stories and pieces. So I was like, I got to step away from this before it becomes a permanent hamper for me.
Was that sort of a simultaneous thing where the Conrad opportunity came up and you were also looking to step away from
Yes.
news?
Yes.
Like, I hope that question makes sense, because that was
Yes.
very
No,
weird.
it happened simultaneously.
So, did you have a plan to step away from news if, like, the Conrad opportunity?
So I had decided I was not going to be re-signing my contract in Orlando where I was. I didn't have a total plan of what would be next.
Mhm.
I decided that, like, if I was going to stay in traditional TV, it was going to hopefully be in like a top 5 TV market. So a New York, a Boston, a DC, something like that. Or I was going to try to make a jump to a sports network or a regional sports network, something of that matter.
Mhm. How does it feel to be the guy that most young podcasters will turn to for advice? I know someone that I consider a very good friend, Jay Shaw, always cites your work and like you as someone that she'd be like, if I need advice, I go to Jon. How does it feel to be like almost like the godfather to like podcasting to some people?
I appreciate that. I've never really thought about that. Honestly, the way I look at it is more just be a good person, right? Like I had an amazing mentor in this industry, Ian Eagle, who I don't know if you know who he is, being that you're in the UK, but
I
he's
don't, unfortunately.
he's one of the top play-by-play guys in sports here in the United States, and an amazing, kind human being who really helped guide me through the beginning of my career. And to this day, the kind of guy that I can just text for advice. So I decided if somebody as big as him and popular as him, who's on national TV day in and day out, can make the time for me, well, then I can make the time for anybody else. So I'm always down to talk to people, mentor young journalists or broadcasters or whatever that may be. And I'm a big subscriber to the belief of try to leave a place better than how you found it. So whether that is a specific place, an arena, or whatever it may be, I'm a big subscriber to that. And I think kindness goes a long way. So if people reach out to me for advice, I'm more than happy to give it. And I was hoping to launch a coaching service earlier this year, but some logistical stuff got in the way. But I'm hoping to have that still done by the end of the spring, early summer, where people will be able to subscribe for one-on-one coaching and helping with broadcasting and all that stuff. So hopefully I can get that off the ground, but teaching and mentoring is a big thing for me.
I subscribe, I'm not going to lie, because I...
Good to know there's one.
I watch a lot of your... I say this about Chris Van Vliet's content as well. I don't watch...
Screw Chris Van Vliet.
Oh, really?
No, I'm just joking. I love Chris. Chris and I have a fake online feud, but that Chris is great. He's fantastic.
Fair enough.
People confuse us at wrestling shows all the time. So
yeah, I can see that.
And by that I mean they confuse me for him, not him for me. So.
Oh, really? So, like, what is one? You talked about mentoring young podcasters, but what is two pieces of advice that you would give someone that's either A, launching a podcast, trying to grow their podcast, or just maybe wants to work with bigger names like yourself?
Number one is a lesson that I learned from my mentor, and it's something I tell people all the time. Pre-production is production. Your broadcast will only go as well as you are prepared. So prepare, do your preparation. It will shine through your work. Mm-hmm. Number two is be different. That's the biggest thing. There are so many podcasts out there. There's so many TV shows. There's so many forms of media. You have to find a way to be different. That's why The Wives of Wrestling is different, right? The Matt Hardy podcast kind of puts a little more of an emphasis on connecting the past to the present, which I think makes it different than a lot of the biographical podcasts. The Strictly Business show is a show about the business of the business. So finding ways to be different is critical.
Mm-hmm. What is the biggest lesson that working with Conrad has taught you about broadcasting, maybe?
I don't know if I've learned many lessons about broadcasting from Conrad, and that's not a slight by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
One thing you have to remember is Conrad and Paul, one of our other hosts there, they're not professional broadcasters. They were more or less fans that started doing great podcasts. Whereas I have a trained background in professional broadcasting. So it's not so much about broadcasts that I learned, but it's definitely a couple things I picked up on. One, really emphasizing the importance of being conversational on air. That's huge. And that can be a tough barrier to break down for a lot of people.
That's something I'm working on. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. And it takes work. And Conrad is so good at that, right? Like when you listen to Conrad, you feel like you're listening to your best friend, just shooting the breeze with them. That's certainly one thing that I've really learned. And personality management is another thing. That's half the battle sometimes is personality management. Everybody that you broadcast with is going to have a very different personality. Eric Bischoff is very different than Jeff Jarrett, who's very different than Matt Hardy, who's very different than Jim Ross, who's very different than Giovanna Engel, who's very different than Kim Orton. So personality management is a big part of that too.
Mm-hmm. And then the big question that I'm going to ask you before we get to a segment that I call generic questions, and then my wrap-up questions is, if I said to you, look, you can only do one of your podcasts that you currently do, which one is it and why?
I'm not answering that question. I love all my babies the same. They all fulfill different parts of me. The Matt Hardy podcast fulfills the true wrestling fan in me. The Wives of Wrestling fulfills the part of me that always wanted to be a lifestyle host in TV. So that's huge for me. The Strictly Business thing, that allows me to fulfill the side that wants to understand the business of wrestling more and work with a guy I've always admired in Eric Bischoff. Up for Debate, that fulfills the traditional TV side in me that likes the sports television presentation. One-on-one, that fulfills the side of me that loves long-form interviewing, because long-form interviewing is my passion in TV. And the Lash LaRue show, Time Limit Draw, that fulfills the live event hosting side of me. So all of them, and I'm not trying to cheap out and take an easy answer, but all of them genuinely fulfill different parts of me as a human and as a broadcaster.
I like that answer, because it's not like you said, I'm not picking one. You gave me reasons for why you enjoy each one, which I think is cool. So before we go into a segment that I call generic questions, what sign is your favorite out of all of the ones that you've collected?
I think Who the Hell Let Jon Alba back in? That's a good one. The If Alba shows up, we riot sign that I got recently. I made my return to a promotion after a few months away, and we got toilet paper just thrown at us as we made our entrance because they hated us so much. And it's funny because, like, I get that a lot. People will be like, "You're so nice, you're so helpful. Why do you like being a heel? Why do you like being a bad guy?" And I don't know if you've seen any of my indie work, but I am a jerk. Like, really, I am a dick. So it's fulfilling the performative side of me.
Yeah.
That likes leaning into that a lot. So I think Who the Hell Let Jon Alba back in is a good one. I haven't really talked about this, but I actually started writing a book recently, and I don't know if it will ever see the light of day, but that is the tentative title of a chapter, Who the Hell Let Jon Alba back in. So
is it true what they say, do you reckon? Like, because you're one of the nicest people I've ever spoke to.
I appreciate
that. The nicest people make the best heels.
I find a lot of the heels I know in wrestling are really nice people. So I think part of it is you want to live out that fantasy of, like, man, I wish I could just be this mean to people. Like it's not in my nature to, but what would it be like if I could be? So it's certainly fun to lean into that. And, you know, with the Emmy back there, I just try to be as pompous as possible and have fun with it.
Before we go into generic questions, the last question I have for you is, if I said to you, pick one wrestler or personality in wrestling you're not currently doing a podcast with, who would you want to pitch a podcast to?
Well, that would potentially ruin some plans of mine. So I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if I can.
Answer.
I don't know if I can go fully into that. Generically speaking, I would love to do more work with Jim Ross on our network. I would love to do something with Mick Foley. Mick Foley would be a blast. He was a huge part of my childhood, so I would love to do something with him. I would love to do stuff with Bryan Danielson one day.
Bryan Danielson pod would be awesome.
It would be so brutally honest. And truthfully, a podcast that I'd love to do, and it might have to wait 10 years or so, but I kind of got it in now, is a Randy Orton biographical podcast, because boy, howdy, the stories that Randy Orton would have would just be
I think
phenomenal.
That podcast would be, I don't know the rating system in America, but it would be like an 18, because I feel like he would swear a lot. I'm not going to lie.
He would be so honest. And I mean, his wife, Kim, is, if you listen to the Wives of Wrestling, she is unreal. I refuse to believe she's even a real person. She's insane in the best way possible. So I can only imagine how great he would be.
So now we're going to go into a segment, John, that I call generic questions.
Sorry, and The Rock. Who the hell wouldn't want to host?
Oh, yeah,
Rock,
obviously.
Right? So yeah, The Rock too.
So we're now going to go into a segment that I call generic questions. This is where those of you that have seen my videos before know that I ask my guests their favorite match, favorite pay-per-view, favorite superstar, favorite theme song, and favorite event they've been at live. So, and basically their questions, they probably get asked on Twitter a lot, that they can now be like, Okay, I've answered this. Go watch that. So, what's your favorite match of all time?
Kind of depends on my mood,
Okay.
but I think lately I'm really in like a big time storytelling mood and all that with what I've been watching. So I would say Okada Omega 2 from the first Dominion match is currently my favorite. Subject to change.
Fair enough. Favorite pay-per-view of all time. And this is split into two segments because this can be a pay-per-view you loved watching at home, and then this can be a pay-per-view that you're like, another pay-per-view that you're like, I've had so much fun being there live.
I don't know if I have one favorite. I think the nostalgic answer for a lot of people my age is like WrestleMania 17.
Mm-hmm.
I've watched the show a million times. There's a lot of great stuff on it. There's also some stuff that's not
aged well.
But that's up there. WrestleMania 30, I was there in person for that. That's an all-time favorite show. That's a genuinely very memorable wrestling show for obvious reasons. All Out this past year, I was there for that. That was an exceptional pro wrestling show. That was one of the best wrestling shows I've ever been to. So yeah, I'd say those are probably up there.
Everyone I've spoke to recently was at that show, and I can't help but feel a little bit jealous. I'm not gonna lie. Favorite theme song of all time?
Gangrel. Not even close.
The Brood, right?
Brood. Yep.
What's the other one? Pay-per-view favorite gear of all time?
Favorite gear. Not somebody that puts a lot of care into gear, honestly.
Fair enough.
I think maybe Kurt Angle had some great singlets like 01, 02 in that era. He had some awesome ones. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of. I love when Johnny Gargano kind of changes up his gear, does some cool stuff. And then I'm just a old school Hardy Boys fans. The black skin tight shirts and the mesh and all that. It's crazy and silly, but I love it.
And then favorite superstar of all time before we go into my wrap up question.
Favorite superstar, so WWE wrestler
or wrestler, whatever.
I think my favorite wrestler of all time is probably Bryan Danielson.
Are you of the same opinion as me when it comes to Bryan Danielson? That this Bryan Danielson we're seeing currently in AEW is the best mix possible of best promos from like picking up experience in WWE and best wrestler bringing back like his Ring of Honor stuff.
Yeah, he's outstanding. I mean, he's doing some of the best work of his career right now. And I'm someone who's watched him for the duration of his career, going back to Ring of Honor. And I think his matches back then might have been a small step ahead just because they're so iconic back during that run. But he's doing amazing work right now. And I'm never upset about seeing him on my TV.
Neither am I. So as we wrap this up, because I do want to be respectful of your time, the question I end all my videos on is with podcasting, with YouTube, and with social media in general. We're all sort of going to live forever in some sort of way. So what is one podcast or YouTube video that you're like, don't go back and watch that? I've grown a lot since then. And then what is one that you're like, if you want to know my body of work, make sure you check that one out?
Well, I don't know if I want to say the one I don't want people going back, because if they watch it, then they're like, oh, hell, I'm going to go back and watch that.
Fair enough.
I don't know. I mean, they're somewhere out there in the ether of the internet. I'm sure you can find recordings of me from 15 years ago somewhere. I hate looking at my stuff from my first week on air and TV when I was like fresh out of college and bad hair. Like it's not great. It's really not great. And my voice was like deeper. It was weird. I don't know what was going on. But an episode that I'm proud of, there's probably two interviews in particular that I'm very proud of. One was earlier in, I want to say end of October, early November. I did about an hour-long interview with Daniel Garcia And I was very proud of that interview. Very proud of that. I felt like we peeled back a layer of Daniel that hadn't really been dived into before. And then from maybe about 3 weeks ago or so, my long form interview that I did with Jeff Hardy on the Extreme Life of Matt Hardy, that Matt was there for as well. Very proud of how we navigated that conversation. I thought it was fair. I thought we asked questions that needed to be asked, and also were respectful. So I was very proud of that.
So obviously, I want to say thank you to Jon for coming on. If you guys like this video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Tom Talks Rubbish. Where can the good people find you as we wrap this up, Jon?
Where can you not find me?
Fair enough.
At Jon Alba on Twitter, JONALBA, lose the H, H's are for losers. Instagram, Jon_Alba. You can find me on Podcast Heat with the Extreme Life of Matt Hardy and the Wives of Wrestling podcast, and on ad-free shows with Up for Debate with Jon Alba, Strictly Business with Eric Bischoff, One-on-One with Jon Alba, and Time Limit Draw with Lash LaRue, plus all the other bonus shows I'm doing over there. So adfreeshows.com, that's the place to be.
It's well worth doing, guys. So if you guys like this video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Tom Talks Rubbish. Follow me on Twitter at Tom Talks Rubbish, and share this video around to help the channel grow. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. Bye.